is pay equity. It was then, it is now, and it probably will continue to be so. I think that women graduates now are going to have going to be judged on their abilities and not their sex in landing a job, but you're still going to be offered less than your male counterparts. And this is true in architecture, it's true in any profession across the board. This is something that still hasn't been resolved, and I don't know that it will be in my lifetime, that it's something we still have to work towards.
My name is Meg Storrow. I'm a landscape architect in Columbus. Speaking from my background, I think there's sort of two issues that I feel are important, and I agree that it is a transition over time. The first is not to have a victim mentality, I think. When you have to confront a discrimination issue, it's very important in how you frame that issue, whether it's with your boss, with a contractor, or with a fellow worker. And I think I've had to learn over time how to frame those issues so that you don't frame it solely on the basis of a personal kind of decision or issue, more in a broader sense. And the second issue for me is again balancing family with your work life, your profession, and I don't think I've successfully solved that problem very well. I think I'm overbalanced into the professional arena, but I may have an unusual situation in that I've married a person that works with me all the time, so we're constantly talking work, and we live that life, and I'd be interested in hearing more about that kind of situation.
I'm Carrie Bergman. I'm Director of Planning for the City of Columbus and for Bartholomew County. A couple of issues that I think are really important to keep in the forefront. One is the problem that is experienced by women who get into positions of management if they're lucky enough to get there. I think that there is still a perception among a lot of people that women are poor managers, that they are emotionally unsuited to do those jobs. In fact, a lot of the studies and research indicate that the opposite is true, but that doesn't necessarily help you when someone comes into your office and thinks that it's very peculiar that you are a woman and you are in charge. And I think that that's something that women have to continue to work on. And I think it's particularly important that women support each other in these kinds of roles. I find it somehow appalling that after all the years of effort on women to advance themselves, there are still so many women who want to keep other women from succeeding, who say, well, I would never work for a woman, or in other subtle ways try to keep other women from achieving what they have achieved. I just don't understand how they expect to get anywhere with that kind of attitude. Men have not done that. They've learned how to help each other, and I think that women need to learn how to do that as well.
When Malcolm asked me to join this panel, I said to him, I'm not the appropriate person to be involved, partly because I hold the senior position here of being the oldest member of the panel, and in many yes, I do. And in many ways, I was a forerunner to some of the problems, and it's a little hard for me to relate and understand what some of the women have gone through in the 60s and 70s. I've watched a change. I think we're moving forward all of the time. I think Joanne had a good statement in the beginning, and the first two people saying that a lot is what we grew up with and where we came from. And in my case, I had no brothers, and my father was in the construction business, and I had a mother who said, you can do anything you set your mind to do. That launched me on a good footing and got me going, and I really had no realization that women were any less than men because I'd always been boosted up. I never had a brother who put me down or anything to that extent. And so as you go through life and you develop from all your experiences, you develop a sense of achievement, and it seems like in mine there's been a lot of challenges, starting with having 4 children in 4 years. And you just grab yourself every once in a while and say, I can do it, and you go ahead and do it. And forget whether you're a woman or a man, you're an individual, and that's the most important thing.
See if this is working. You know, it is such a treat for me to sit here and look out there and see all of you young women out there, because when I was in school, I graduated. You may be slightly my senior, Claire, but not a great deal. And when I entered Auburn in 1960, it never occurred to me there was anything odd about having my teachers say, gentlemen and Val, because that was me, and I was there. And so you all are here. Someone asked me the question at lunch, how do you recruit more women? And I think that's obviously done. You all are here, and you're obviously, and I know you're doing well because I've had Ball State students through offices where I've been. I think the issues, some of the issues have to do with women, and some of them have to do with the profession in general. I'm a partner in a small firm, and as I see it, and that's by design, a small firm, that's where I've chosen to be, the key issue in many ways is learning how to go through your life as an architect or a design member of the design profession. I'm sorry, I'm very ethnocentric here. How to do that and how to learn how to be a key player. And my way of being a key player is different from Sheila's, but each of us is able to be that. And we find our own ways. There are many different things that people in design do. When I first got out of school, my big issue was competence. And that's true of all of you, men and women, for a while. Women need to learn how to get past that. I had to. That was painful to learn to get past being concerned about competence. Then you need to learn how to get past learning how to manage and how to be perceived as a manager. And eventually, where you have to get to, whether you are with a major firm, with a public agency, or in practice for yourself, you need to learn how to be a person who can take a risk, take a stand, take a position, learn how to sell it, and learn how to do something with it. And that is not different from what men have to learn, but we have a lot of different things happening along the way, and I wouldn't minimize it. I have 2 kids. Every time I had a kid, I lost ground, and that is really true. I love them, I adore them, you know, and they're growing up and they're wonderful. But it is very difficult not to lose time vis-a-vis your male colleagues, and it's very hard to just roll with it. Other people may handle it better than I have, but that simply is true. I think another thing that is an issue for all of us, really, and there's this is going to sound rather terrible, but the profession as a whole we are at a point where it's very hard for us to maintain ourselves as being key, important members of the building process. And as women, what can be a potential danger there is that if we are not perceived as people who are capable, and if we do not act in capable ways, then what can happen is that can erode the position of the profession in general. I guess what I'm saying, much of that is, yes, there are things that men should do for us in terms of letting us into positions in here and there, but we've got to take the bull by the horns to some degree. We have all the skills, we have all the education, but I think those issues really are ones that, another issue is that balance between compensation and the effort in your education. That's a difficult one for every architect. Every architect is underpaid. There was an article Bob Kennedy, who's currently president of the AIA, put in our chapter newsletter that a young architect can end up on food stamps if they have a large family, or can end up eligible for that. That is a crime and a sin. But it's something that we have to convince people of our worth societally. As women, we tend to get into positions where we make less money. We have to find ourselves. We have to constantly not let that happen to us. And I think those are some of the issues that I see. I'm not sure, sort of going back to what was on the card there, I'm not sure that it's not recruitment. You all are there. There's so many more women in architecture in Indianapolis than there were 15 years ago, and it's wonderful. And I think that part of it is a matter of time. Well, and the AIA, yeah, although, there's been a sprinkling along the way. That's true. Yeah, we will have the first woman president. There have been, and participation, that's a key thing, participation in not only the professional organizations, but in the community, and always, letting ourselves be known. We're architects, we have this perspective, we have usefulness, value to the community, as well as just on a drafting board, or at a computer, which is what I use.
Okay, I guess to Andrea then, and that's for the last of the panel.
Thank you. My name is Andrea Ferster. I'm an attorney in the historic preservation field. I work for a nonprofit, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I'm responsible for the National Trust litigation and advocacy programs. So my experience is not really directly relevant to women in the design profession. But I do think that there are a number of pressing issues that working women in general are facing these days. And that is the need for employers really to develop structures and accommodations to workers with family obligations, both men and women nowadays, particularly since there's so many families with both parents who are working, or so many single parents. And I think there absolutely needs to be some changes to make those accommodations, including things like daycare facilities, job sharing arrangements, and this a general recognition in the professions that a work week does need to be 35 to 40 hours and should not be more, and adequate family leave for the birth of a child or medical or family events. And I think if the employers aren't willing to make those changes voluntarily, there's got to be some pressure put on our policymakers to pass laws that require those accommodations to be made for professionals and workers with family obligations. And I think once the workplace does recognize that their workers do have lives and obligations outside of the workplace, and I think a lot of attitudes will change.
I have a question again then for the entire panel, and anyone can jump in who wants to, but it's really a two-parter, and it starts out, do you feel that the environment has changed for women since you started practice? Has the environment changed? Secondly, the other part of this is, do you feel you have changed in order to make progress in your career? And if you've changed, how have you changed, do you think? And anyone can, Claire?
I just have a facetious answer.
Okay.
It came up in the course of the conversation at our lunch table, and one person was saying that they weren't recognized, they weren't listened to, and I said, all you have to do is have gray hair and then people listen to you. And Sheila agreed with me that she had tried coloring she turned gray at an early age, and she tried coloring it, and it was when she let it go back to the natural gray that people listened. Yes, Val.
As far as have things changed, well, I will give you one anecdote. The first office I ever went to get a summer job after my freshman year, the venerable old partner came out and said, "Honey, why don't you go home and learn how to cook?" Yeah, things have changed. And don't forget it. Have I changed? Yeah, and I went through a whole range of different changes. There was a period of time, there's a very funny photograph of me on the cover of what used to be the Indianapolis Sunday magazine, and I was probably 9.5 months pregnant with my little bow and my little blazer on. I've changed. I've learned that I don't have to look and act like a man because I'm not one. And I suppose that was obvious all along, but it did seem like there was a period of time where we had to somehow, we could not be ourselves. We couldn't stress our own individuality, and we had to try to be as corporate as possible, and so forth and so on. Now, people are in different practices, and when you're in a more corporate practice, of course, you are somewhat more along those lines, but fortunately, I think the maturity that women in working are learning is that we can be ourselves. The funny part is that I'm not totally certain that isn't something that we've known all along. I had lunch with an old friend of my mother's. I come from a family of professional women. This woman was a psychiatrist, and she's 77. And as I looked at her, I thought she's always been herself. She had 4 children. She's always been, and which is not a sign of femininity one way or the other, but still, she's always gone her own way. We've had our role models all along, if we've looked for them.
Yes.
I think probably the most dramatic change has to do with just the numbers of women that are involved in these professions now. I heard Val mention what it was like when she was in school. I talked to the group that I had lunch with, that when I enrolled in graduate school in community planning in the 60s, I was the only woman in the program. That made a very different environment for people entering the profession than there is now. Now you walk into many planning offices, and no one's surprised to see women in positions there, professional positions or managerial positions. In the 60s, when I got out of school, it was very unusual to find that, and so it was much more difficult then, I think, to initially get into a position that would lead to an advancement. I think it's easier now, but there still are difficulties. In the bigger the city, it seems to be, the worse they are. The large departments are much more reluctant to promote women than small towns are. And I certainly hope I've changed over those years.
Terry, I've got another section for that, just given your answer, another portion of a question. Do you think that the work climate for women design professionals will continue to change as more and more of us go out into the workforce? And how? What do you think those changes might be? Here we are. Joanna's got an answer. Okay, Terry, you think, and let's. Okay, just a second.
I feel that it's changing almost daily, and I think it's for the better, because I think the women that I know, and at least speaking for myself, because I know myself the best, and that is that the best approach to take, and I've had to learn this, and this is how I've changed, is to help people become aware of the fact that you're not posing a threat by any means, that you should be measured and evaluated upon your capabilities only. And I see that more and more and more every day, that, working hard, just as what, we've all been saying here, and mixing in a little patience with the fact that you're not going to change the situation overnight, that you're going to have to accept how people perceive you and how coworkers perceive you, and you're going to have to work with that. You cannot push your ideals and your beliefs in that situation. And I think I've learned over the course of time to sit back a little more and to do a little more listening, and I see more people doing that, and I think that's going to have a profound effect. I'm with a firm that's owned and operated by 17, it's 2,500 people in the firm. It's owned by 17 male partners. And unfortunately, I'm of the belief, after I've been there now for 5 years, that they've been hit pretty hard because of the fact that there are 34 associates within the firm outside of the 17 partners, and they just last year named the first female associate. And a lot of that has to do with, and I believe some of it has to do with the fact that there are less percentages of women in the field of engineering primarily, because it is primarily an engineering firm. So I think, and I did want to add that I think in some cases it isn't a matter of women not being able to be moved ahead, but because of the actual percentages of employees within a firm. But I see it changing, and I see it changing it for the good.
I'd like to address both of those questions together and give you a little anecdote. I work frequently with a partner in a firm in Indianapolis who is anybody's guess, but he's over 70. He's a very vital person, very, very interesting person. And he graduated from a college, from a university on the East Coast in the 30s, and approximately a third of his class were women. When he found out I was the first woman to graduate from Ball State, he was just absolutely flabbergasted. He couldn't believe that in 1974 or 73, they hadn't yet graduated a woman from the school or from the state. So I think it was a regional issue. The convention in St. Louis that Eileen Davis referred to, the 4 women students from the school went over there to participate in that convention, and we were presented at registration. They had a map that showed all the states and the representation of women in the profession and in the schools in each state. The largest representation was in Hawaii, with about half of the registered architects in 1973 were women. Then you saw concentrations on the East Coast and then on the West Coast, but the Midwest, there were virtually no women in the profession or in the schools. So this regionalism seems to be fading away. There seems to be a more generalized representation across the United States. For the last several years, I've been involved with the American Institute of Architects in a subcommittee that they established called Women in Architecture. For a while, I was a local chapter representative, and now I'm liaison for Indiana and Kentucky. And through that office, I get statistics that show an increase in representation in the AIA, which I think also relates to the representation of women in the profession. And the latest newsletter indicates that the regular membership, which are those architects who are registered and recognized by state certification, that 7.22% of the registered architects are women. That's a very low percentage. But then you look at the associates, which are the young graduates that have not yet been certified, have not yet passed all their tests, and you see this 25%. And I think the difference in those two percentages tell you something, that there is a radical and quickly escalating increase in women in the professions when you see that we're moved from 7 to 25%. Last year, the representation was 22%. So there's even more than this year than last. So I think you're going to begin to see what you see here in this assembly and this university is that you're going to, as the graduates, the percentage of graduates increase, percentage in the profession will also. And as far as the prospects for the future, I think that speaks to itself.
Going back to sort of the question about how how has your environment changed and how have you changed? I think another point from my background, which is what I'm speaking from, is that you have to become very self-confident and a leader. And I think most of the women up here that you see are leaders in their chosen areas. When my first job was with a civil engineering and surveying firm, and I was the only woman, but I was also the only design professional. And instead of, and what I learned from that was that I sort of became the conscience for that firm on environmental issues, because I had such a different kind of approach to land than these civil engineers did. And in a way, it was enhanced by my being a woman, and it gave me a leadership opportunity. And I think that first very early experience has really shaped the way I've approached my profession ever since, because I realized that I had to speak out, I had to be strong, and say what I felt the issues were, which weren't necessarily always the issues that the firm wanted to hear about.
Excuse me. Yes, going for the non-existent microphone. My question for any of you is, how has being a woman most, do you think, made your own experience both more difficult and perhaps, in your own eyes, more rewarding? What kinds of rewards do you think you've gotten? Claire?
I'm not sure that I'm addressing your question directly, but one thing that comes to my mind is the fact that through the 60s and the 70s, women were called upon to prove themselves more so than men. I don't think there's any denial of that. And what it meant was, when you went into a meeting where you knew there were some very chauvinistic men, that you did your homework more than once. You went over it until you were so sure of the stand you were taking that you could defend it from every angle. Well, it seems unfair that women are called upon to do that. But on the other hand, that's a very positive advantage, because they come out knowing much more and being able to handle the situation a lot better. So while it's a negative, it results in a very positive force, and I don't think that's all bad.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Anyone else? Yes. Andrea.
I think that one of the most rewarding things about being a woman and a woman professional is that there is an expectation that you will take some time off when you have children, or that you do need to get home at a reasonable hour when you do have children. And while, of course, we all feel the pressures of not being able to stay late and work as hard or perhaps be on the same tracks as our male colleagues, I think our male colleagues really, in the end, lose out by not having the workplace perhaps respect their decisions or their desires to stay home and spend more time with their children. So I think that's one of the most valuable things about being a woman, is that in many ways the sexist attitude that women have the primary caretaking responsibility is a disadvantage to men, because they perhaps are losing out by not having that experience as fully as women do.
Yes. I guess. Let's see. Terry, and then Meg.
Since Claire set the tone earlier with facetious comments, I have one to make now too. One of the things that planners, particularly those of us in the public sector, get to deal with on a regular basis is hostile members of the public. And one advantage to being a woman is that people really are more polite to women than they are to men. People are much more likely to come into the office and scream at the men who work there than they are to scream at me. They clean up their language a little bit. They're less likely to grab me by the collar and threaten me than they are to males. And so I really think that women are an asset in the planning office for that reason.
And sort of going along with that, I also feel they're an asset on the construction site. I think that I've often been in the situation where I'm the only woman on a construction site, and I think you get a lot more attention, you're heard a lot more, and if you know what you're doing, you can really make an impact.
Does anyone else? Yes.
just a brief comment to people being more polite to you in the planning profession. You obviously have never worked in Bloomington, Indiana. I've had more than one gun waved at me for failing to permit building permits.
Related to, no, Val, go ahead.
You know, this isn't quite on the positive side. I hear what you're saying, but I have to say that, and I can speak for, maybe I'm speaking mostly for myself, but I'm not the only woman I know of who's like this. For me, architecture has been very much more akin to substance abuse than anything else I can think of. That when you do something and it works, it is the biggest high I can imagine. However, the downside of that is that my family does suffer. I don't go home. I mean, I don't want to admit it. I've pulled an all-nighter lately. I'm too old for that. And I think there are a lot of people who've learned how to balance things, but the wonderful part about architecture is that it's consuming. That is also the difficult part about architecture, is it consumes you too.
Was there any point for any of you? It sounds as if most of you have had a real dedication, almost an obsession to the kinds of work that you're doing, and that's just been so much a part of you, you couldn't have done anything else. Have any of you ever hit what they used to call and still call a glass ceiling? And that's an artificial cutoff point, I think, as I've written it down here, an artificial cutoff point where returns for added effort and success become so personally minimal, and the stresses of competition, particularly with male colleagues, so great that many women just cut back and simply mark time or slowly drop out or work part-time, and other things that tend to be more rewarding take over. Have any of you hit that point? We have two answers, Joanne first, and then Meg, and Val. Okay.
Yes, I guess I can say I'm at that point, and am going through a period of self-evaluation, and have been for about a year, and am coming to some answers as of recent. But that glass ceiling exists, and it's there, and you could almost chart it out on a curve. That is, the more you work, the more you get paid, the more you're expected to do, and the returns decrease. So you'd have an up curve and you'd have a down curve, and I'm at the pinnacle of those 2 points at this point. And it forces you to ask yourself a lot of questions. I have 2 small children. Because of that, it helps you redefine your priorities in your life, and that doesn't mean that it's wrong to say that your profession may not be the priority that it once was. And I think we're under that pressure too. It's okay. It's what you're comfortable with. It's what you're comfortable with, and it's how you define your own balance. But yes, that glass ceiling is there. And how you get through it, you can't define, because I think it's just different, and the factors vary from situation to situation. But I believe there are ways that it can be worked out.
We have 2 more responses. I have another question I think I'd like to throw in here. One thing I'm looking at is adequate childcare. Another is adequate networking systems and support systems of other women. As the 2 other people, I guess it's Val at this point and Meg, and anyone else who wants to get in on this one, answer. Are you finding any way that those systems help you deal with glass ceiling issues?
I guess I confronted the glass ceiling issue by starting our own firm. I had reached a point in the firm that I was working for where I didn't think I could really go much higher. And I was an associate, profit sharing and all of that, but the principal will always be there, and you'll never get to be that principal status, at least in the firm that I was working in. So I confronted it by being my own boss, which allows me to have flexibility in my schedule if I can do that, if I choose to do that. And I think that's probably an option that a lot of women do take. They start their own firm, or they start a firm in partnership with other people. Responding to the networking and childcare issues, I think networking would be great. I found ASLA for me, even though it wasn't necessarily a women's issues kind of opportunity. It was a way for me to talk about my profession and meet other people and get out of isolation. And I think I do a lot of community work for that same reason, so you don't get isolated and buried in an office or a studio. Childcare, I can address that. I think that one of the most important aspects of childcare has to do with the other parent that's involved. And I'm very blessed with that, in that my husband takes a very vital role in picking up where I have to leave off and back and forth. And there's no question ever who needs to take over and when. I mean, it's never a question that he has to ask me or I have to ask him. It's just understood that one of us, is there. And I think that's very important. And I think that's one of the marvelous things that come out of women, and it doesn't relate to the design profession, but working women. And that is my husband happens to be a second-time father. He has 3 grown children, and then we've had these 2. And he has been able to evaluate the difference and what a more rewarding parenthood he has been able to achieve, because he's in a position where he has to play a more nurturing, a more caring, and spend more time with the children. So that's a good thing that has come out of that. I think child care is critical. I think it's important that the child understands the needs that the parents have to seek a profession. And when I asked my daughter one time how she feels about me working, she said, "Well, what would you do?" And she said, "Well, I'm not sure I'd like you here all the time." That was very enlightening to me. But I think it has a lot to do with your attitude about your children and your children's, care, and as to how they will respond to that also.
A couple of things. Yes, of course, there's a glass ceiling. Absolutely. Getting ownership in a firm is very, 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 being a primary person in whatever setting. It's very hard to get to. I, too, eventually decided that the best way around it was to simply start my own firm. Now, it's not that simple, folks. And that's the whole point. The reason, in many respects, there is a glass ceiling is because to step across that, to step from being an associate or being a project manager or being a person who is given a great deal of responsibility, even authority, to somebody who is able to be a primary actor is very simple. You've got to bring in work in some form or fashion. And what that means is that for all the support that the AIA is, or the ASLA is, and it is, you don't get projects out of that. You have to be a member of the community. You have to find a way to sell yourself. You have to find a way to sell services. And if you want to break through that ceiling, that's really where it is. And it took me a long time to find it out. I don't know that I have learned that as well as I could have, but by George, that's absolutely the case. And what that means is that networking is with other people, and the way to start it is right now. With other people that you know who are going into different professions or different walks of life. With your friend who goes into banking, for goodness sakes. She eventually, or he, either one of them, will be in a position to lend money to people or might be in a position to recommend you to somebody who wants to do a building. That's where you really go. The child care thing, I'd like to mention just one thing. Don't forget that it is not an invalid decision not to have kids. We keep talking about child care. I have 2 children. I have a 20-year-old son. I have an 11-year-old daughter. I adore them. I also have a lot of friends who don't have kids who are quite happy, good people, enjoy life. It is, I don't think we should focus on that too exclusively.
Question. We've looked at having children as one way of sort of backing out almost, in a sense, or finding oneself seen as having backed out of a professional role. Were there other factors that at times that had nothing to do and that you found yourself feeling backed out anyway? Or did you face other kinds of discrimination besides the potential for being a mother? Were there other types of discrimination you faced? Go for it.
I faced many kinds of discrimination. One is doing the same workload and not being paid the same, or on a construction site being told that you don't belong there because you are a woman and you don't know what you're doing. I think that's very common, and it's very important to confront those issues right at the time in a way that's non-threatening, and we have to figure out those manners that are non-threatening.
Does anyone else have an answer for that?
I think, go ahead. I was going to say, I remember this is an anecdote, I suppose. I remember once a young woman who in fact was an interior designer, and I don't mean this comparatively, but she came back from a construction site and she said all the guys there were whistling at me. Well, she's a very attractive young woman and she had on a very short skirt, and I thought, what does she expect? To some degree, yeah, we should say, oh, you men shouldn't look, but I mean, yes, they do. And if to some degree you have to be a little pragmatic and say, you take the step that helps them not have any excuses to see you in a way other than how you want to be seen. Because what you're really there for is to do a job and, wear the neat outfit somewhere else.
Ball State prepared me for being an architect in many ways, not the least of which was exposure to discrimination and other points. I'll say that when I graduated from Ball State, I had seen probably the worst of the problem. And that once I was out in the field and in the profession and in the real world, that it wasn't as bad as it was in school. There were, when I first started trying to get a job, there were offices that said, we have an all-male drafting room and we won't interview you, just flat out. But that was just the first 2 years. And after I had the first experience and the first office job to put on my resume, it wasn't that hard.
Yes, Andrea.
I can't resist passing up an opportunity to comment on Val's remark. I think that that men on construction sites, if they choose to make remarks or to whistle, will do that regardless of what a woman is wearing. And I think that the way to deal with that is probably not to change your dress. I mean, I think not being in this profession, I would assume that you would want to wear clothes that are comfortable for going on a construction site, and that should be your consideration when you're dressing to go on a construction site. So obviously very high heels would probably not be wise. But I think that women who go on construction sites, whatever they wear, may well get whistled at and may well get comments. And what I would do if I was in that situation, and I have to say I have not been in that situation, so I'd be very interested in hearing what people have to say, but I would request that their supervisor ask them to stop whistling and making those comments.
Can I respond to that? I find it much more effective. I've never bothered to do that in my life. It's much more effective to tell them that you want to prove what they're doing. I mean, you've got control over them when you really think about it if you're out there.
Okay.
Men and women have to be a little tough on a construction site anyway.
At this point, we've had about an hour of discussion in between the group of us. What I'd like to do for a half hour now is to open it up to questions from the floor. And if the students have things to say or questions to ask, we have a microphone here, and anyone who'd like. It's open mic.
I got it. Can I ask one? The discrimination issue before, do you think that the issue is worse with colleagues than it is with clients or the public that you deal with?
I think it's probably worse only because you deal with your colleagues day in and day out, just by virtue of the fact that you're with them a good majority of your day is probably why I think it might be worse with them than clients. No, because I think by the time you have a client, that in my situation has been that in most cases the client has hired you because they are comfortable with you, especially if you are in a management position at that point in time. So really, and I have to say too that the discrimination has really, covertly and overtly has been rather minimal in my situation for the last 15 years. And although I've seen it get better, I think it's improving, and I don't think it's escalated or to a point where new graduates should fear it.
I'm wondering, in dealing with colleagues and with your own behavior, do you find that you're walking a thin line between being too friendly and not being taken seriously, and being too serious and being considered aloof and not very personable? Is that a problem? I mean, you all sound very much like be your own person and that kind of thing, but are you conscious of how you act in order to get along better with your colleagues?
I think people, men and women, will develop their own administrative styles, their own management styles based on what works for them. And I think if you try something, try what comes naturally and it doesn't seem to be working for you, then you modify it. Personally, I am one to take a friendly, a very convivial attitude towards my staff and towards the contractors that I work with. But I see others that take a different approach and also find it effective. It really has to work with you. You have to be comfortable with the style. If it's something you're not comfortable with, it's not going to work for you.
I think I probably have a style similar to yours, but I think that it is a problem for a lot of women. And one of the reasons is that behaviors that are considered to be normal and acceptable when they're performed by men are not considered normal and acceptable when they are associated with women. Males can get away with being tyrants somehow in an office a lot more than a woman can. And I do think that women have a more difficult job in figuring out how to work all those relationships out. And the ones that succeed are able to strike some kind of balance there. I think that all the people that work in my office are comfortable there, and I don't doubt that if we've got some big project and they all need to stay there till midnight, they'll do it, and I don't have to go in there and crack the whip over them. If I were to give one piece of advice to women that are going out into the work world, it would be to keep your sense of humor. I don't think there's anything more stifling in an office than a person who is totally humorless. And I think that a lot of women who have been unsuccessful in getting into management jobs have been like that. They are so deadly serious about everything that they just can't loosen up and get the job done.
I can't sit here and be quiet forever. I'm looking into the future, thinking that I think if you're going to practice, whether it be architecture, landscape architecture, or interior design, you have to start off with a basic love of people. You can't respond to people's needs unless you understand people. So it all falls into place. And once you get your handle on understanding people, responding to their needs, you do it on an interpersonal basis as well.
So I think you'll find it'll all come in time. It just sometimes takes a little bit longer than you're willing to wait.
I come from a firm that has 4 registered women architects. I'm the oldest one in the office right now. And it's kind of interesting for me because I can look back now and see where I was a few years ago. I did the very same things they're doing now. There's one woman architect in the office who's very aloof, very dead serious, like Claire was talking. And she's kind of separated herself from the group, and she's really not getting ahead because of it. There are others that are more convivial, and for the opposite reason, they're not getting ahead. The truth of the matter is you do just have to do your best job and relax a little bit. Have a sense of humor is an excellent piece of advice. I wished I had had more sense of humor earlier too, that I've learned.
I think some of the greatest training I've had has come from being a parent, because there's nothing like testing your managerial skills when you have 2 angry 2-year-olds. And when I came to my present position, I was asked why they thought I could be such a good manager. And at the time, we had 3 teenage boys. And that's what I said. And I said, because I'm the stepmother of 3 teenagers. And they 3 of them, I'll never forget, looked at me and said, well, we've never heard that before, but it sure makes a lot of sense, because they're obviously parents. But there's a lot to draw from that. Not to say that colleagues are like children, but your situation, sometimes they are. But you can deal with those situations a little differently, I think, and approach them in a little more calm fashion and with a little more love, like Claire had said. I think once you understand what parenting is all about.
Right next to that, my boss said the other day that someone in the office couldn't handle something, they couldn't juggle more than one thing at a time. He said, you'll be able to do that here, parent.
You can line up if you want to, the easiest way.
When you were saying that you felt there's more discrimination when you were in school than when you got out, I basically don't feel any of that right now. And I was just wondering if you think there will be the opposite of that when we get out, if there will be more discrimination, and if so, how you would suggest to handle it.
Well, I think it's great that you don't find that now. I think that's marvelous, and it has to do with the representation that you have now have such a high percentage of women in the field or in the school. There are a couple of young women, still intern level architects in Indianapolis that I know of, who resist becoming involved in the AIA or in the Women in Architecture group because they feel they've never known discrimination and that's not going to affect them. But I've got to believe that at some point in time they're going to encounter it either on construction site or on income inequities, and they're not really going to know how to react because they ignore the fact that it could still exist. The bottom line is that someplace out there you're going to run into some discrimination. If it isn't in school, it may be with your coworkers, it may be with the contractors, it may be that you hit that glass ceiling when you're headed straight up the ladder, you know you're going to make partner, and suddenly you don't. You've got to be aware that the potential is there, and you can't ignore the fact that human nature is such that the good old boy network is still out there, it's still active. There are those people who are going to resist you being in the profession, and it would be wonderful to think that you could go through your whole professional life and never encounter it. But don't be just totally shot down when you do encounter it. You know, recognize it, determine how to get around it or through it. But to ignore it is the wrong thing to do. It's sort of the Chicken Little syndrome, you know. If you ignore a fact, that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't there. If you develop an approach early on, then you can handle it when it comes up.
Could I make a comment too? I once heard, and I'm a little suspicious always of people who are able to sort of say, well, people fall into one of 4 categories, et cetera, and so forth, but sometimes it's helpful to think a little bit along those lines. And
One thing somebody told me a long time ago that was a little helpful to me was the thought that if men have not been in, say, an office setting or a school setting, wherever they've not worked with women, if they don't have any other experiences, then what they fall back on is their role models with women now, and that those tend to fall into one of several categories. Most of us, at least the majority of us, have a mother, or they have a sister. They have a sweetheart. They have, there are various other kinds of roles like that. And sometimes what you can feel is that somebody's trying to treat you like one of those roles because maybe they aren't exactly sure how to treat you. And that is simply a matter of establishing some communication there. Now, it isn't always that easy, and it isn't always that fun, but and it doesn't always work. But in truth, I think that what you all will find is probably a diminishing problem with that, simply because there will be more women who operate in different ways and therefore who aren't as easily categorized that people will be in contact with, and it will be somewhat easier for you. And so when that happens, try to, in a sense, I would say try to, if you can, I mean, you'll be mad and everything, so, and I would be, and often am, but just try to put yourself thinking, doing that, and sometimes it helps you deal with them, not necessarily like that, or them.
I want to address the issue of family. I'm a single parent, and I'm a graduate student, bring my son up here, and I know some other graduate students, males, sometimes they have their children, they bring them up to school with them. And this whole family issue, it seems that with women in the profession, it's kind of brought family into professionalism, and I was wondering, I've been to even several community planning meetings where people on plan commissions have their kids sitting there coloring at a desk or something while they're conducting a meeting. And if it's loosened up a lot of the formality and even liberalized the professional a bit, and that men also are able to admit to family commitments, they have to get done with the meeting, and that everybody's a little more accepting of the role of the family playing, and the women's, commitment to their profession, and also allowing men to admit that family commitments are also putting limitations on the time they can spend at meetings.
I've noticed a big difference. When I was at home with my kids for 5 years, I did freelance work and contract work. And my oldest son went with me to almost every meeting I went to. But I had clients that understood, except for one. I took my oldest son in a stroller and contract with a firm. He had told me that I could bring my child or whatever. Well, we got there and he decided to get cranky. And I thought I was going just to pick up some work and leave. And he decided he wanted to talk about things. And he told me very politely, but I could tell he was upset, not to bring my child again to the meeting, which I didn't. But I've noticed more and more that men are more understanding. I've seen men bring their children to the meetings. Occasionally, I was in a meeting the other day where some nurses were in there. We work on a healthcare project, and she brought her son. He sat in the corner very quietly and played, and colored, and so on. So I think it is being more accepted, and I think men are bringing their children just as much as women. I don't think you can do that in every case, and you have to be very careful to ask ahead of time so you don't run into an embarrassing situation. I must have turned 40 shades of red when he said, please don't bring him again.
I'd have a question then, and that is the same question over again in another way, but does it seem to you as if the presence of children in the workplace should or should not change to some extent? And if to any extent, how much? In other words, should there be a total separation between home and work?
I can speak to that again. Part of the reason I went back to work for a firm was because I was deciding that I couldn't mix the two. Once I got the second child in there, I couldn't take them to meetings. They would not behave. One child, one-on-one is different than two, just different. And I also began to feel that my professional image was changed by bringing children and trying to mix things. There are places where it's not appropriate. And I found also that personally myself, I could concentrate better. I felt more focused on the work at hand, and I felt that it was better for me. And I found that when I was trying to juggle kids and family, I could get an hour and a half attention span at one time. Now I'm in an office, I can work 8 hours on one project. It's wonderful. I don't get interrupted so many times, and I think it's better for me and better for my professional work.
Well, I agree. I don't think I could get much work done if I brought my child to the office at all, and I try to avoid it. I think one of the things, though, that some of the law firms in Washington are doing, which is extremely helpful, and that is having backup daycare facilities available to their employers. And that's one of the biggest disruptions that I think parents face, is that when their children, their normal child care provider is somehow unable to take care of their child, and they're completely left with the inability to go to work. They have to stay home and take care of their kids. And some employers are having daycare facilities that are operating as backup for the parents, and I think both men and women workers are taking advantage of them and find it very useful.
I wish that would be possible in architecture. I don't, with the exception of, for example, HNTB or a very small handful of firms. They're not architectural firms. You all know what the size range of architectural firms is, and landscape architectural firms in the country. More of them than not are small. So small that even healthcare becomes a major, health insurance is a major thing to try to squeeze out of the financial structure of the whole firm. The point being is that I think that, support cooperation, the more, and I think in some ways the unfortunate societal kind of trend where there are more single-parent families, including more fathers raising children, all those things loosen it up in terms of support for your need to do this or your need to take a child to the doctor and not to have to apologize for it. But I think in terms of being able to expect that you all coming out of school may have this actually available to you, the scale of the professional operation is probably not going to allow that.
I think it's important that as you go into a new job that you meter out some of these expectations with your potential employer also. I am in a situation where my boss has 2 small children, and it's ideal because I feel that he is very sensitive to what has to go on, and it's not that you can sit down and ask this person who's interviewing you what age his children are, his or her children are. But I think it's something that I see a trend towards. And I see much more flexibility with superiors, people in management positions who have small children, and they understand. They just simply understand more. So that would be a factor, I think, in looking for a position.
My question runs along the lines of humor and discrimination. I think that today the discrimination is much more subtle than what you may have been faced with. In fact, I've never had someone suggest I learn how to cook, which is a good thing because that's a lost cause anyway. But in your experience, I was curious to know how you have dealt with things like lewd jokes, inappropriate behavior, condescending attitudes, and maybe even inappropriate touching. What do you do about things like that?
For myself, the jokes I personally ignore. They don't bother me, and I ignore them. Now, I think in the kind of office setting in which I work, they're not particularly extreme or offensive. I do object to people's humor if it's racially motivated or in other ways just not appropriate to the kind of setting in which we work. I think that all women in the workplace have some time in their career faced some kind of behavior that's related to what was described here on construction sites, only it is more subtle when it's in an office. And I think you kind of have to handle it on a case-by-case basis. Every situation is different, and people respond differently to those kinds of situations. There's some men that might do those kinds of things that you can just say, hey, look, that's just not appropriate. You shouldn't do it here. And they'll say, oh, I didn't realize, and they'll back off. Others, it's not that easy. I had one guy that worked for me who just tried to cause any kinds of problems that he could possibly cause in that office. And I was lucky at the time because I went to the town manager and said, this guy is impossible. I can't work with him the way he behaves. The town manager called him in and said, she's the boss, you do what she says. If you don't like it, quit. And I didn't have any more trouble with him after that. Not all bosses are that understanding. I really think you have to sort them out on a case-by-case basis and try to determine ways to deal with them.
I think another part of it is to have a really good sense of how to handle yourself in cases like that. For example, I can remember one boss who used to send me out on construction sites the only days I ever showed up in little white skirts and white shoes, high heels and stockings. In the back of the car, I had for myself a pair of corduroy jeans, a lumberjack shirt, and a pair of heavy lace-up field boots. I learned to change in the car. So in other words, by the time I started out, I was, there she goes in the little white outfit. God, she'll be a mess by the time she comes home. What happens is he meets me out at the construction site, and I am dressed more like a construction worker than he is. And it works. After one or two times like that, it generally doesn't happen again. So at any rate, it's just sort of a be prepared, and if you have to do something that means that you can be more prepared, just sort of learn as you go. But just don't let them catch you out.
I can remember hearing things come back to me after a while, but this was not a job experience, but I was enrolled in the review session for the AIA exam for the instructional materials. And I went in, and there was a group of men. They worked all day, and they were there taking the review to become architects, registered architects. And of course, I was the only woman, and they were really very cold. They weren't friendly at all. And I couldn't figure out why. I had come in at about the third or fourth session. I was late starting in the class. And I just didn't understand it. And after several weeks, they didn't talk. They weren't friendly and everything. After several weeks, I found out that they had started their sessions with dirty movies. And they were told that now they had a woman in the session, they wouldn't be able to have their dirty movies anymore. And so that's why they were so unfriendly. And I wasn't anything I could do except hold my head up and just make the most of it.
It is, I think, what was mentioned earlier about responding to each and every situation differently. Sometimes the best response is no response at all. So when a comment is made, and this is how I've changed. 10 years ago, I would have lambasted someone for making a particular comment. Now I have found I say nothing, and I merely look at the person, and that's the most wonderful way of forcing them to hear themselves. And so I think you learn over time that whatever you can do to force someone to hear themselves is appropriate too.
Yeah, frequently the person that's making the comment, making the joke, being obnoxious is doing that just to get you riled up, and if you don't respond the way they want, then they won't repeat it, or at least they won't repeat it very often. And that if your response is, as she says, to ignore it or to stare them down, maybe you can affect their attitude
more than they affect yours.
Because to come back at them is just putting you in a defensive situation, and that makes the situation even worse. And that holds true with many things, whether it's a confrontation with a female or a male colleague. That is, a good approach.
Perhaps I'm not as good a person as some of you all. Fact is, my husband tells raunchy jokes, and I laugh at them if they're funny. And I have a good friend, a colleague who's an architect, who is very given to that. And when they're funny, I'll laugh if I think they're funny. And I reserve that right to choose. And if not, I say that's gross. I don't think that's funny. I worked for a guy at one point who was an extremely good person by his own rights. I never heard him use a 4-letter word. I never heard him say anything bad. And I must tell you, he was the most discriminating, rigid, and unpleasant person I ever worked for. Look a little bit at substance as well as at what comes out. Look at how the person acts and not just what they say.
Your question also mentioned unwanted touching as well as lewd comments, and I think something does need to be said about the fact that there really is a difference between letting things roll off your back when it really would be the best way to deal with it, and when there is a situation that becomes essentially a hostile work environment. And the lawyer in me tells me to tell you that if you are in a situation where the unwanted touching and the comments rise to such a level that you do feel that the work environment is hostile, I would say document, and document.
Ma'am? No, yes. This is exactly the point at which I was going to pull you in. So you have the floor for the next 15 minutes or so if you want, not only to respond to this, but to start in on pulling some of this together. And then I want to go back to the panel for one last question.
This has been fabulous for me to listen to. I can tell you that here in Muncie, Indiana, you are right on target with the rest of the nation. What I've heard here, I've heard across the nation. Now, why would Noel ask me to talk? I have to give you a little bit of my background in that in 1971, it was discovered that I was the only woman teaching landscape architecture in the United States. I couldn't believe it, but I took charge of a task force to discover if it was true. There was one other woman teaching, Claire Cooper Marcus, an environmental scientist at Berkeley, and she was teaching in the landscape architecture program. So I have seen 20 years of students, 20 years of teaching. I graduated from Berkeley in 1965 with no students prior to the women's movement, and I saw tremendous change before and after the women's movement. I probably need my glasses, but the issues that are going across the nation is pay in the glass ceiling. It is true. 15 to 20 years later, the women are paid $8,000 less than the men. They are not getting the management positions. They are taking an interest in maybe raising their families. So the issue of raising a family enters into it. Do they back out of the job to raise the children, or is the job unrewarding because they're not making enough money and getting the responsibilities that they want? That's a debatable issue, and you're going to hear all sides of it. The issue that comes up is what should you wear? Is the way you dress and present yourself important? You should be able to be yourself. I think that's what we hear across the country. We went through phases where women wore the gray flannel suits. They looked like the men, they talked like the men. That didn't work. You should be able to be your own person, but we're not quite there yet because there is a very subtle discrimination. It was obvious in 1965. It was really obvious. I couldn't get work. That's illegal now. And that's, you get into harassment, document. That's all you can do. When somebody says or does something to you, write it on a piece of paper, drop it in your desk. It will repeat itself if it is real. And you have a legal system, and you must use it. If you don't use the legal system, nothing can change. The changes that we have seen in 20 years is because there have been women trying to make a change. And where are we in that change now? There's a worry in 1992 that there's a glass ceiling. Now, there are some historical facts you need to know. 1936 was a bad year. You might write that down. Why 1936? We got into a depression and women were cut out of study. Only 5% of the women in many schools could be, only 5% of the students could be women in schools of urban planning, architecture, and possibly landscape architecture, where up until that time they could. That made a big difference. Women born prior to 1936, Claire, which you might be, had mothers who were professional, or a much higher rate of professional mothers. They felt they belonged. The students born in 1940, 50, and 60 had mothers and aunts and uncles who thought they should stay at home and raise children. They did not have the competence base they needed. In 1970, the mothers are telling their children, you can do it. So in 1990, I expect the students to go out and do it. And that's what I have to say. I think 1996 is going to be a wonderful year. And it's confident.
Yes, question here.
I'll take some questions if you want them. There is an ASLA salary survey done in 1989, and I believe you'll have it in your library. Is that right, Jeff? The salary survey is in there. They start off the same because you're not allowed to discriminate in pay, and then the pay raises come. But 15 years later, the women dropped by $8,000, and their bonuses are unbelievably less than the men's bonuses.
This is a recent issue of Planning Magazine. I don't know if some of you planning students may get this magazine. This was a special issue last July on women and minorities in planning, and the cover itself is pretty cute. I don't know, some of you might want to stop and look at it on your way out. It just shows a woman here watching television, and the guy on the TV is saying, studies show that women with sexy names like Dawn and Cheryl are less likely to be promoted to managerial jobs than women with names like, and it's ... and the woman who's sitting here watching says Bill or Roger. And in here there's a chart that shows the salary layout for people in the planning profession, and actually at the outset they're fairly close, although women are slightly less. But by the time there is 10 years of experience, the men are making somewhere on the order of $1,500 to $3,000 a year more than women with the same amount of experience and the same amount of education. The discrimination does exist. And of course, if you happen to be a minority female, you can figure on probably $5,000 less income, because that's where the heaviest discrimination takes place. It is there. It is part of this glass ceiling idea. It does stop people from progressing the way they should. The comment I made earlier about the difficulties of women in a big city, I think, is really indicative of this whole trend, because that's where the higher salaries are. And you don't find very many women planning directors in the big cities. You find lots of them in little towns like Columbus, where I am, but you don't find very many of them in cities of 500,000 people or more.
And the American Institute of Architects have done similar studies. Women in Architecture is about to publish their study of salaries and attrition.
And basically, it's this along the same lines. After 10 to 15 years of experience, women are making about 80% in the same general position level.
One interesting fact that could make the men a little frightened is that there is a book called The Souls of the Skyscraper, which is the history of the women clerical workers in Chicago. It's a wonderful book. It shows you how in 1870 only men were secretaries. Men were the clerks, men were the secretaries, men did the letters, kept the charts, did all of the work that we now associate with secretarial work. In 1917, women were not allowed to take secretarial courses in high school. It wasn't until 1917 that they could take courses. It was a male field. The first women who broke into being secretaries in Chicago wrote letters home to their parents saying, I got a job as a secretary. I write 25 letters a day. I think I can do it. They're a little nervous because they haven't had a woman for this job yet. I mean, that's astounding. Well, by 1920, they got to take secretarial courses. By 1930, 40, they had taken over the profession. By 1930, 40, 50, they had been ghettoized. The pay for secretaries had dropped in half. It had become a female field that no men could really enter into. They couldn't take the courses in the high school, but they didn't want to because the pay had dropped so drastically. So you take a look, if you allow the pay scale to stay low for women, there's a chance that in our whole profession, the ceiling for pay is going to drop down. So I think it's something that we all need to look at together. There's also one thing that was very different about your panel than across the nation. Almost every woman here talked about children. Now there are a lot of women talking about not having children. This could frighten men. If the women decide not to have children because the facilities aren't there to raise the children, care for the children, if they're not taking part in it, civilization doesn't go on. You know, you can be real dramatic about that, but this is a two-way street. At Berkeley, the women told me, marriage? Heck, we don't even have relationships with men. Now you can say that's going a little far, but if we don't provide, our society doesn't provide and change the environment for raising children, who's going to do it? We need dual incomes. We need to earn the same. We need to participate the same. So this group is a great one to sound out how to handle the children in, but I think you'll find in the more, say, on the east and the west coast, half of this group would not have children and wouldn't even be thinking about it. And half of those would not be thinking about marriage.
I think at least 3 out of 8 of us don't have children.
Maybe it was just who responded to the question. Thanks very much, Mim. That's great. We are about to close at this point, and I've got one more question for each one of you. Let's start from the left this time with Andrea and go across. And that is, what advice would you give today to both men and women entering the design professions? In other words, for both women and men, what advice would you give today?
Well, I'm going to speak now from my profession, which is in historic preservation. And for men and women who want to enter into the historic preservation area, and I say that equally because the historic preservation field has very traditionally been very gender integrated, so we haven't really experienced the kinds of problems in that area that may exist in other design professions. But people who do want to enter into the historic preservation area should probably be willing to relocate. That's what I hear from my colleagues in this area, is that there are good jobs out there, and a lot of them, but you often have to be willing to relocate and go to a different city.
I suppose what I would say is as you go through your schooling and even your first years working, try to feel in yourself, if you really love what you're doing, if you really, really get excited about it, keep at it. If not, there are a lot easier and more remunerative ways of making a living, both in terms of juggling family and everything else. But if you just can't do anything else, then do it. So.
I think that so much of the pleasure that comes and the success out of any of the design professions is the dealing with the people. And in order to deal with the people, you have to totally understand yourself. So what I would encourage you to do is spend some time looking inward and understanding yourself, and thereby translating that to the next step of sharing, enjoying people, and then the pleasures that you get from what you're doing are immeasurable.
My perspective may be a little different too, because I'm not really a designer, but I know there's some planning students out there too. And I think one piece of important advice that I would give you is to try to be flexible. Learn how to be a problem solver and to be able to change. The planning profession is a lot different now from what it was when I got out of graduate school in the late 60s. And if I hadn't been able to change with it, I think I'd be in real trouble now. And the other piece of advice that I gave you earlier, and I really mean it, is keep your sense of humor, especially if you're going to be in a job where you've got to deal with all kinds of people in the public. If you take it too seriously, you'll kill yourself.
Well, I'll build on what's gone before me, because all that is good advice. I also feel another piece might be to do the best that you can. Try to always remember that this is maybe only your one chance, and you have to keep learning and improving and strive for quality.
Well, I think that when I was in school, the image I had of myself was being in an architectural practice and eventually becoming a partner or principal. And I think all of my classmates had that myopic goal in that we were going to be architects in a conventional office in a conventional manner. My biggest advice to you, especially since the economy now parallels the economy when I graduated from college, is don't close your mind to alternate jobs or alternate positions. When I graduated in '74, the economy was very bad. Firms were closing their doors. People who had jobs were losing them. So there was nothing out there for a young graduate, even if I'd been a male, I wouldn't have been able to find a job with any ease. So I started working for the city of Bloomington as a city planner. I spent 4.5 years as a city planner before I went into a conventional architectural practice. And once I was there, I just discovered I didn't like it. So for 11 years, I've worked for the university, or for Indiana University at IUPUI as a facilities manager. I think that would be the general terminology, where I'm responsible for represent the owner for construction projects. It's a fantastic position for me, and it's exactly what I want to do. And I think that there are so many other architecturally related positions and jobs out there that you shouldn't close your mind. If you can't immediately find a job with SOM or one of the other major mega firms, architectural firms, think about alternate jobs, things that you may find as satisfying or more satisfying than a conventional architectural practice.
What I have to say picks up a lot of what's already been said also. This profession is so cyclical. I also graduated in 1974 when they had the first oil crunch, and I learned early on to kind of be a jack of all trades, but at the same time to do well what you do well. You know, if you can do one thing well, do one thing well. If you can do 4 things well, do 4 things well, but don't do 2 of them halfway. That has enabled me to ride the tides, and I've been through several. Also, you know, to be a good listener and not be afraid to admit your mistakes and go on. Part of the job is taking a risk. And so it didn't work. Okay, I learned to take what you can from it and learn from it and go on, and the next time you'll do better.
A lot of the focus this afternoon has been emphasized, has been placed upon starting at a certain level and working your way up, no matter what the type of job you might have. And I guess my advice would be is not to be disillusioned about what direction you want to go to. You start out, you know, at one level, and you want to work yourself up to an owner or a principal in a firm, and that's fine. But there are sacrifices, and there is an enormous amount of stress involved, and there's an enormous amount of work involved. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that don't not enjoy the trip. And life is all life is I think determining a balance. And don't lose sight of your interests, and don't lose sight of what's important to you in addition to your profession.
I want to thank all of you for being on our panel today. And Malcolm has an announcement.